Hello everyone, welcome to Introduction to CSS. Now we have done a course on HTML, just an introduction. Not really deep dived into the core concepts of HTML, but we have a video on HTML. In this video, we'll be going into the basics of CSS to give you an idea of how CSS works, CSS styling, and a little of box model and all of that. So hang in there and let's jump right in. Now, what is CSS? CSS, or Cascading Style Sheet, is a style sheet language used to describe the presentation of a document written in HTML. So it allows developers to control the layout, design, and visual appearance of web pages, separating the content from its visual representation. So you can see CSS enhances HTML by adding styles and designs to the web page, making them visually appealing and also user friendly. So just imagine a web page without CSS. It's just going to be straight up uninteresting. So CSS is the magic that happens to your web page that keeps you on your web page whenever you visit them. So some of the ways it enhances HTML are number one, it adds styles, improves layout, create responsive designs, which is one of the core of CSS to make your website responsive on both mobile, desktop, and tab. Different screens for different kind of designs. It also keeps your HTML clean and presentable. So to put in short, CSS turns plain HTML into beautifully designed web pages, hereby providing control over the visual aspect of your site. Okay, so now how does a CSS syntax look? A basic CSS rule consists of two parts. Number one is a selector. Now, this specifies the HTML element that you want to style. And number two is your declaration block. Can contain one or more um, lots of declarations, just like we're going to see when we jump into our VS Code. So actually write some CSS code. And these declarations are usually enclosed in curly braces. So just like you can see on your screen, here is an example of your selector has a property and then the value, property and value. So for instance, here you have your P, which is a selector, the HTML element, and then a property which is color, and then the value of your property, which in this case is blue. Now let's look at some examples. Okay, so we are here on our VS Code. Let's quickly write some HTML elements. Let's say H1 and a paragraph. Save that. All right, so here on our screen, we have our H1 elements. This is a course on CSS, and then just some paragraph text here. So now this is an example of your selector. So in this case, H1 is going to be the selector wrapped in curly braces, and then your property, which can be color, can change the color to red. Can also have another property here to say center it. Okay, so now this is an example. We have three properties here. We have the color, which is red, the text aligned to center, and then the border of this H1 element of this selector here, which is 2 pixels solid blue. So here you have your selector, property, and value. So this is how a basic CSS is written: selector, property, and value. Now let's look at some basic selector types in CSS. Number one here is our universal selector. Let's get rid of this. So how do you write a universal selector? It is represented with um, get rid of this hashtag and the curly braces. Now, what is the function of a universal selector? It is used to select everything inside of this HTML document. Everything inside of this body will be affected with a universal selector. So we can say and set the margin to 0. And notice everything here is affected. The H1 and the P element is affected. So your universal selector is used to select everything inside of your HTML document. Next, we have the type or element selector, which is what we just saw. The selector P with the property um, and then the value. Next, we have a class selector. Now, let's see how that works. So, an example would be to give this a class of center. Let's give this a class of center, and then let's get rid of this. So we can come here and say, now this is how you select your class selector dot center, and everything else just follows the same syntax. Okay, so we have written some styles here. Now, one very important attribute of your class selector is that it is reusable. So it means you can add the same class to multiple elements. So let's give you an example. Let's say we have another H1 here. Give it a class of center, and let's just write some code in it. Maybe we'll say, now notice how it immediately centers itself on the page. Why? It already has a class of center. So this class can be reused um, in different aspects of your web page. So you use this when you want to write a reusable code all through your web page. You can just give it the same class, and then whichever style you have given to it here will also reflect on the element with that same class. Let's say we also come and give this a class center. Now, it also aligns with the style that has been given to that class. So classes are reusable form of code, so you can use it for different forms of your HTML elements. Next, we have our ID selector. Now, your ID selector is kind of similar to your class selector, just that the main difference is for your ID selector, it cannot be reusable. So ID selectors are um, pretty much unique to the code or whichever element it is you are attaching it to. So if we add an ID of let's give it an ID of unique and save it. So now, how do you call out your ID selector? Use the hashtag. So we give it the color of red. So now we cannot give another HTML element this same ID again. It's not going to work that way. All right, so your ID selectors are pretty much unique to whichever element you're attaching it to. So it's used when you want to have a unique styling to a particular HTML element and you don't want that to be reusable. So that is where you use your ID selector. Next, we have the attribute selector. Now, this is used to select a specific type of input. So let's jump to our code and write some inputs here. So we can say, so we are going to change this text. This is an input of text, um, number, and email. So here we have three input types. So in a situation where I want to only style the input type of text rather, so what I can do is I can say, let's give it a border so that can be visible. Now notice only the input type of text is affected. Why? I have used the attribute selector to select the type of text. What if I change this type to number and save that? I will change this to our input type of number. So I have the liberty to select whichever type of input I want. So you can use this in a situation where you have multiple inputs on your HTML document and you want a different type of style for a particular type of input, probably a text input or your number input, and you want some unique styling on each input type. So you can use your input selector to select the type of input you want to start. Next is our group selector. And as you can see, pretty much simple as it is, our group selector can be used to select multiple HTML elements. So right here we have H1, P, and input. So let's just select that. Um, uh, H1P. Let's give this another style here. Let's say H2. Hello world. So now notice how all the color changes to blue. Okay, I made a mistake. It's supposed to be comma, not dots. All right, so you can select multiple HTML elements using the group selector, and you can go on and on as much as you want. Now, the next kind of selector are your pseudo classes. Your pseudo classes, or the other name is dynamic state. Now, I like to use it mainly to style buttons, but there are also other usage of this. So I'll just show you how it works. So you can try this for our H1. H1. Now, I have given this an instruction that whenever I hover around my H1 element, the color should change to black. And here it is. I can also decide to change the font size and say 300 pixel. Just something pretty obvious now. Okay, that's too much. All right, let's say probably 80. I think 60 is okay. Save that. Now notice whenever I hover around this, it changes to black and the font size increases. And that's how you use your pseudo class selector to give an instruction of whatever is going to happen when you hover around a particular HTML element. All right, next is the pseudo element. So let's look at an example. So we can say P. All right, I can decide to give a particular styling to the first line of my paragraph element. I can change the color to black. Notice the first line of all my um, paragraph elements have changed to black. I can decide to select the first letter. Right now, notice how only the first letters are affected. I change the font weights, or let's say the font size. Let's say that's a pixel. Now notice the first letter of my P element have been affected. So that is how you use your pseudo elements. All right, so we have looked at this before, your properties, different kind of properties, color, or your text color, your font size to select the size of your text, font family, one thing we didn't look at, but I think Visual Studio Code has a lot of font family installed, so you can try that. Your text align, we did look at that to align your text to center, left, or right of your code. And then we have our values, red, auto, pixel, just like we have seen. All right. All right, so next we'll be looking at our CSS box model. Now, this is something that everyone has to understand if you are writing your CSS code, because it gives you an idea of the dynamic of every CSS or HTML element and how to style it. Now, so the CSS box model is a fundamental concept in web design that describes how elements are structured and rendered on a web page. So simply put, every HTML element is considered a rectangular box, just like we see here on the screen, and the box model defines the content layout and the space around it. So here we have an example. We have our content, and our next after the content we have our padding, and then the border, and then your margin. So your margin is like the external environment of your HTML content. Then you have your border. We have seen that earlier, but we're still going to jump back and look at that. Then we have our padding and then the content itself. So this is a typical example of your CSS box model. And understanding this will give you an idea of how every CSS element works. And it's also going to help you when you run into an issue with element placements and how to, maybe your element is not following a particular style. You're going to know which part of your box model should be either added or reduced to help you, make everything to be in line. So now let's jump to our VS Code and look at an example. Okay, so you're going to write the H1 elements. I'm going to give it a class of box. I say this is a box. Right, just have to remove this styling on H1. Okay, I think that's normal. So sorry. Now, so just like we have seen in our CSS box model, this box here is the content in play. Let's look at the border property. So this is the border of your box. This is the border around it. So next, let's look at how the padding works. Let's give it a padding of 20 pixel. Now notice it is within your border of the element that is affected, not outside of the element. Now writing padding 20 pixel is shorthand for writing. Now notice it is the same thing. So this is like the longer form of just writing your padding 20 pixel. So there's also another way of writing this. You can say it's pretty much the same, or you can decide to short it further to padding. Now, what this does is this is your top and your bottom, this is your right and your left. Now, let's confirm that. I can decide to give this let's say pixel. All right. So notice the padding top and the padding bottom have increased, but your padding left and right still remains the same. Let's change this to let's say 50. I'll see the difference. Your padding left and right has increased while the padding top and bottom remains the same. So this is one way to, add padding um, to your HTML element. When you want a different size of padding for both your top and your bottom, and then your left and your right. Or if you want a consistent padding, you can just um, give it a single um, value here, which is 30 pixel. Now the same goes for your margin. Now notice what happens when I give this a margin of 50 pixel. The external aspect of your element is now being affected. So margin, just like we have said earlier, is like the external factor of your element. Now it also works with the same shorthand like we have seen. Padding, it has your margin top, margin bottom, margin left, and margin right. So it follows pretty much the same pattern of shorthand. Um, we can also decide to say 100 pixel. Now this is Notice the change here is in your right and your left, while the top and the bottom remains the same. If I make this 500 pixel, all right, so that's a lot of margin. You don't really want to do this, but just for the purpose of this class, 500 pixel margin. And notice the difference between the top and the bottom. Now, if I decide to write another element after this, it is going to come after the margin. So let's write H2. Notice it comes after. So all of this space here is the margin for this particular element. While you have your padding inside, you have your border and your margin. So this is pretty much how your CSS box model looks. And understanding this is pivotal to having a consistent styling in CSS.